The helicopter blades cut through the thick Afghan air like knives through silence. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera pressed his back against the cold metal wall, his medical kit secured tightly between his boots. The steady thrum of the rotors had become white noise after 3 tours, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the darkness seemed heavier, more threatening than usual. 5 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Marcus checked his equipment one final time. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, morphine, airways, everything in its place. After 8 years as a Navy SEAL medic, these movements had become automatic, muscle memory born from countless missions and too many friends lost. His calloused fingers traced the edges of his trauma kit, finding comfort in the familiar shapes and textures. The mission briefing had been standard. Extract a high-value asset from a compound 15 clicks north of Kandahar. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance, but Marcus had learned long ago that intelligence was often wrong. In his world, you prepared for the worst and hoped for the best. Target building in sight, came the pilot's voice again. Looks quiet down there. Through the small window, Marcus could see the sprawling compound below. Mud brick walls enclosed several buildings, their flat roofs casting angular shadows in the moonlight. No movement, no lights, no signs of life. It was almost too quiet. The helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and debris. Marcus was the third man out, following his team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jay Thompson, and their point man, Petty Officer Sam Rodriguez. The rest of Bravo team followed in practiced silence, their movements fluid and coordinated despite the heavy gear and weapons they carried. The compound's outer wall was 8 feet high, topped with rusted razor wire that glinted in the starlight. Rodriguez made quick work of the wire cutters while Thompson scanned the perimeter through his night vision goggles. Marcus positioned himself to provide immediate medical support if needed, though he hoped tonight would be one of their easier extractions. Breach point clear, Rodriguez whispered into his radio. They moved through the opening in single file, weapons raised, senses heightened. The compound's courtyard was larger than it had appeared from above, with several smaller buildings scattered around a main structure. According to their intelligence, the asset was being held in the basement of the central building. Marcus had seen enough missions to know that the real danger often came not from what you could see, but from what you couldn't. The silence felt wrong, artificial. In his experience, there should have been dogs barking, guards talking, some sign of human presence. Instead, there is only the sound of their own careful footsteps on the packed earth. Thompson raised his fist, signaling a halt. Through hand signals, he directed half the team to secure the perimeter while the rest prepared to enter the main building. Marcus stayed close to the entry team. If someone was injured during the extraction, every second would count. The door to the main building was unlocked, which immediately put everyone on edge. Thompson pushed it open slowly, checking for tripwires or other booby traps. Finding none, he motioned for the team to proceed. The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. The smell hit them immediately, unwashed bodies, fear, and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. Medical training had taught him to catalog scents as potential indicators of injury or illness. This particular combination suggested people had been confined here for some time. They found the stairs leading to the basement behind a heavy wooden door. Thompson sent Rodriguez down first, followed by 2 other team members. Marcus came next, his medical kit ready. The basement was darker than the floor above, lit only by a few candles placed in wall niches. And that's when they found her. She was chained to the far wall, sitting on the dirt floor with her knees drawn up to her chest. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair matted and hanging across her face. At first glance, she appeared to be a local woman, perhaps in her early 30s, held captive by whatever group had been using this compound. But something about her posture caught Marcus's attention. Despite her obvious exhaustion and the circumstances, she sat with a certain alertness, her head positioned as if she was listening for sounds the team might have missed. Her breathing was controlled, measured, not the rapid, panicked breaths he typically saw from trauma victims. Target acquired. Thompson spoke quietly into his radio. Preparing for extraction. Rodriguez approached the woman with bolt cutters for the chains, while another team member checked the rest of the basement for additional prisoners or threats. Marcus positioned himself where he could see both the woman and the stairs, ready to provide medical aid or defensive fire as needed. When Rodriguez knelt beside her to work on the chains, she looked up for the first time. Marcus found himself staring into a pair of green eyes that seemed far too alert and calculating for someone who had supposedly been held captive for weeks. There was no relief in those eyes, no tears of gratitude. Instead, there was something that looked almost like assessment. "Can you walk?" Rodriguez asked her in broken Dari, one of the local languages. She nodded, but didn't speak. When the chains fell away, she stood slowly, testing her legs. Marcus watched her movements carefully, looking for signs of injury or weakness that might slow their extraction. What he saw instead was someone who moved with practiced caution, checking her balance and flexibility like someone who knew how to evaluate their own physical condition. "Any injuries?" Marcus asked, stepping forward with his medical kit. She shook her head and spoke her first words. "I'm fine." Her English was clear, unaccented, and confident. Thompson's head snapped toward her. "You speak English?" She nodded again, but offered no explanation. The team began moving toward the stairs, the woman walking between Rodriguez and Thompson while Marcus brought up the rear. As they climbed back to the ground floor, Marcus noticed that despite her apparent captivity, she moved quietly, placing her feet carefully to avoid making unnecessary noise. It was the kind of movement that came from training, not instinct. They were halfway across the main room when the first shots rang out. The muzzle flashes came from multiple directions: windows, doorways, what sounded like the roof. The team immediately took cover behind whatever furniture and structural elements they could find. Marcus pulled the woman behind an overturned table and immediately began assessing the situation. "Contact front and right," Thompson shouted into his radio. "Multiple hostiles. Unknown number." The gunfire was intense, but not accurate, suggesting either poor lighting conditions for the attackers or inadequate training. Marcus had seen both scenarios before. What concerned him more was that this felt like an ambush. Someone had known they were coming. "You need to stay down," Marcus told the woman, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. What happened next changed everything Marcus thought he knew about their mission. Instead of cowering or showing fear, the woman immediately began scanning their surroundings with the same tactical awareness Marcus had seen in his own teammates. Her eyes moved in patterns, corners, windows, potential exit routes. When a piece of debris from an incoming round struck near her head, she didn't flinch. Instead, she noted the trajectory and whispered to Marcus, "3 shooters on the north wall, at least 2 more on the roof." Marcus stared at her. "How do you—" "There's another way out," she continued, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "Kitchen, back door. It leads to an alley that connects to the main road about 200 meters east." Thompson had been trying to coordinate their defensive position when he overheard her. During a brief lull in the gunfire, he crawled over to where Marcus and the woman were taking cover. "Who are you?" Thompson demanded, his eyes hard and suspicious. The woman met his gaze steadily. "Someone who wants to get out of here alive, just like you." Another burst of automatic gunfire forced them all to duck lower. When Marcus raised his head to return fire, he noticed the woman had somehow acquired a piece of broken concrete that she was gripping like a weapon. Her knuckles were white, but her hands weren't shaking. "Rodriguez," Thompson called out. "Can you see the kitchen from your position?" "Negative. Too much smoke." The woman touched Thompson's arm. "I can get you there. But you have to trust me." "Trust you?" Thompson's voice was incredulous. "Lady, we don't even know who you are." "My name is Sarah," she said simply. "And right now, I'm your best chance of getting out of here alive." Marcus found himself studying her face in the flickering light from the muzzle flashes outside. There was something about her features, something familiar that he couldn't quite place. But there was no time to puzzle it out. The gunfire was getting closer, and he could hear boots on the roof above them. "Sarah, what?" Thompson pressed. She hesitated for just a moment, and in that hesitation, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. He'd heard that particular pause before from operators who were deciding how much of their real identity to reveal. "Connor," she said finally. "Sarah Connor." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He knew that name. Everyone in the special operations community knew that name, though most had only heard it whispered in secure briefing rooms or mentioned in classified after-action reports. Major Sarah Connor, Army Special Forces, the ghost of Helmand Province. The woman who had single-handedly held off a Taliban assault for 18 hours while calling in air support for a downed medical evacuation helicopter. The woman who had been captured during a classified operation 6 months ago and was presumed dead. The woman who was Marcus's younger sister. He hadn't seen Sarah in 4 years, not since their father's funeral. Military deployments and operational security requirements had kept them on different sides of the world, communicating only through brief, heavily censored emails. But even with her dirty hair and torn clothes, even in the dim light and chaos of the firefight, he now recognized the strong jaw they'd both inherited from their father. The way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right because of an old training injury. His sister was alive. His sister was here. And until 30 seconds ago, his sister had been their mission objective. "We need to move," Rodriguez called out. "They're trying to flank us from the west." Marcus felt the world spinning around him. The woman beside him, Sarah, his sister Sarah, was calmly pointing out tactical options and escape routes while bullets flew around them. She had no idea who he was. The beard he'd grown during this deployment, the tactical gear, the dim lighting, and the stress of the situation had rendered him unrecognizable to her. "Marcus!" Thompson grabbed his shoulder. "You with us." Marcus forced himself to focus. Personal revelation or not, they were still in immediate danger. There would be time to process everything later if they survived. "Yeah, I'm here," he managed. Sarah was already moving, staying low, but heading toward what Marcus assumed was the kitchen entrance. "Follow me," she called back softly. "Single file, watch for the broken floorboard about 3 feet from the doorway." As they began moving through the building, Marcus found himself staring at his sister's back, noting the way she moved through the space. Even after months of captivity, she moved like the Special Forces operator. She was smooth, purposeful, aware of every sound and shadow. The kitchen was small and cluttered, with a back door that opened onto a narrow alley, just as Sarah had described. Thompson sent Rodriguez out first to check for hostiles, followed by 2 more team members. Marcus and Sarah were next, with Thompson bringing up the rear. The alley was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the ongoing firefight they could still hear from the main building. Sarah led them through a series of turns and connecting passages that Marcus realized she must have memorized during her captivity. "How do you know this area so well?" Thompson asked as they paused at a corner. "I've had a lot of time to study it," Sarah replied simply. They reached the extraction point just as their helicopter came into view. Marcus helped Sarah into the aircraft, his hands shaking slightly as he realized that for the past 6 months, his family had been told she was dead. Their mother had cried for weeks. Their younger brother had requested immediate deployment to Afghanistan, hoping for a chance at revenge. As the helicopter lifted off, Marcus found himself sitting across from Sarah, watching her face as the adrenaline of the escape began to wear off. She was staring out the small window at the landscape below, and in her expression, he could see exhaustion, relief, and something else, a kind of sadness that spoke of experiences too difficult to share. She had no idea that her brother was sitting 3 feet away from her, that the medic who had helped extract her from captivity was the same boy who had taught her how to throw a curveball in their backyard 15 years earlier. Marcus wanted to tell her, wanted to pull off his helmet and reveal himself, wanted to hold his sister and tell her how sorry he was that it had taken them so long to find her. But military protocol demanded debriefings and medical evaluations before personal reunions. More than that, Something in Sarah's demeanor suggested she wasn't ready for emotional revelations. She looked like someone who was barely holding herself together, and Marcus didn't want to be the one to break whatever careful control she had built around herself. So he sat in silence, checking and rechecking equipment that didn't need checking, watching his sister and waiting for the right moment to tell her that her big brother had helped bring her home. The helicopter flew through the night toward the main base, carrying with it a reunion that neither sibling yet realized was about to unfold. The field hospital at Forward Operating Base Chapman buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Marcus walked through the automatic doors carrying his medical kit, the familiar smell of antiseptic and the sound of machines beeping filling his senses. It had been 3 hours since the extraction, 3 hours since he'd discovered that the woman they'd rescued was his sister, and 3 hours to try to figure out how to handle the situation. Sarah had been immediately taken to the medical unit for evaluation and debriefing, standard protocol for any recovered asset, but especially important for someone who had been held captive for 6 months. Marcus had watched her disappear behind the medical bay doors, noting how she moved, still alert, still careful, even in what should have been a safe environment. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the chief medical officer, approached Marcus near the equipment lockers. She was a Navy commander with 15 years of experience in combat medicine, someone Marcus had worked with on dozens of previous cases. "How's our guest doing?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice casual while he cleaned and restocked his trauma kit. "Physically, she's in remarkable shape considering what she's been through," Dr. Walsh replied, consulting her tablet. "Some malnutrition, dehydration, a few old injuries that healed poorly, but nothing life-threatening. Mentally," she paused, looking thoughtful. "That's a different story." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean?" "She's very controlled, very guarded. Answers questions directly, but doesn't volunteer information. Classic signs of someone who's been through significant trauma and has developed coping mechanisms. She's going to need time and probably extensive counseling." "Has she said anything about her captivity? About how she was treated?" Dr. Walsh gave Marcus a sharp look. "Since when do you take such a personal interest in our patients, Sergeant Rivera?" Marcus realized he was being too obvious. "Just wondering if there's anything we need to know for her medical care. Sometimes the psychological trauma manifests as physical symptoms." "True enough," Dr. Walsh agreed. She did mention that she'd been held in several different locations before ending up at the compound where you found her. Said her captors moved her frequently, probably to avoid exactly what happened tonight. "She say anything else?" "Not much. She asked about contacting her family, which is standard. Most people want their loved ones to know they're alive as soon as possible." Dr. Walsh paused. "She also asked about you." Marcus's hands stilled on his equipment. "About me?" "She wanted to thank the medic who helped get her out. Said you stayed calm under fire and made her feel safe." Dr. Walsh smiled slightly. High praise coming from someone who's clearly been through hell. Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. Pride that his sister recognized his professionalism, sadness that she didn't recognize him personally, and anxiety about how she would react when she learned the truth. "Is she cleared for visitors?" he asked. "Limited ones. The psychiatrist wants to complete his evaluation first, but she can have brief visits from team members involved in her rescue." "What?" Before Marcus could answer, Lieutenant Commander Thompson appeared beside them. "Dr. Walsh, how's our package?" "Stable and recovering. She's in room 7 if you want to debrief her." Thompson nodded, then turned to Marcus. "Rivera, you should come with me." She specifically asked to speak with the team medic. Marcus's heart rate increased. "She asked for me?" "Said she wanted to thank you properly." "Come on." They walked down the corridor toward room 7, passing other medical staff and patients. The base hospital was always busy, treating everything from combat injuries to routine illnesses. Marcus had walked these hallways hundreds of times, but tonight everything felt different. Thompson knocked on the door before opening it. "Sarah, you have some visitors." Sarah was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, dressed in clean army fatigues that were slightly too large for her frame. Her hair had been washed and pulled back into a simple ponytail, revealing the full extent of weight loss from her captivity. But her eyes were alert and focused, and when she saw Marcus, she stood immediately. "You're the medic," she said, extending her hand. "I never got a chance to properly thank you during all the excitement." Marcus took her hand, feeling the familiar calluses from years of military training. Her grip was firm, confident, exactly like he remembered from their last meeting 4 years ago. But there was no recognition in her eyes, no spark of familiarity. "Just doing my job," Marcus replied, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "No, you did more than that. You kept me calm when the shooting started. You positioned yourself between me and the incoming fire. That's not standard protocol for protecting an asset." Thompson looked interested. "What do you mean?" Sarah glanced between them. "Most extraction teams would have used me as a shield or left me in a secure position while they handled the threat. Your medic here made sure I was protected at the expense of his own tactical position. It was—" She paused, searching for words. "It was the kind of thing someone does when they actually care about keeping you alive, not just completing the mission." Marcus felt heat rise in his face. He had reacted instinctively to protect his sister, but she had interpreted it as exceptional professionalism. "Speaking of which," Thompson said, "we need to discuss what happened back there. The intelligence we received suggested minimal resistance. Instead, we walked into what looked like a prepared ambush." Sarah's expression grew more guarded. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking how a supposedly random group of Taliban fighters knew exactly when and where we would be conducting an extraction mission." The room grew quiet. Marcus could see Sarah processing the implication of Thompson's question, and he didn't like what he was seeing in her eyes, a hardness that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation. "You think I set you up?" she said flatly. "I think someone did. The question is who." Sarah looked directly at Thompson, then at Marcus. "Lieutenant Commander, I've been held prisoner for 6 months by people who wanted information I wouldn't give them. If I had wanted to betray American forces, I could have done it much more efficiently than by waiting for a rescue mission." "Then, how do you explain?" "I explain it by pointing out that you're asking the wrong questions," Sarah interrupted. "Instead of wondering if the prisoner betrayed you, you should be wondering who else knew about the mission. How many people had access to the operational details? How many knew the timing, the target location, the extraction route?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting there's a leak in our intelligence?" "I'm suggesting that in 6 months of captivity, I learned a lot about how my captors operated. They had information they shouldn't have had. Details about American operations, troop movements, patrol schedules. Someone's been talking to them, but it wasn't me." Marcus found himself admiring his sister's tactical thinking even as he worried about the larger implications of what she was saying. If there really was an intelligence leak, it would explain not just tonight's ambush, but potentially other operations that had gone wrong in recent months. "Do you have specifics?" Thompson asked. "Names, dates, operational details they mentioned during interrogations. I memorized everything I could, hoping it would be useful if I ever got out." Sarah's voice was steady, professional. "But I'll only share that information with someone who has the appropriate security clearance and a genuine need to know." Thompson nodded slowly. "I'll arrange for you to speak with the intelligence officers. In the meantime, I need you to understand that until we can verify your information and determine the full extent of any security breach, you'll be under protective observation." "You mean I'm still a prisoner?" "You're under protection. There's a difference." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Not from where I'm sitting." Marcus watched this exchange, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. His sister had been through months of captivity, had just been rescued in a firefight, and now she was essentially being told she couldn't be trusted. But he also understood Thompson's position. Operational security demanded caution until all the facts were known. "Is there anything else you need medically?" Marcus asked, try to redirect the conversation to something he could actually help with. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "Just rest, I think. And maybe—" She hesitated. "Is there any way I could contact my family? They probably think I'm dead." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "I'm sure arrangements can be made once the debriefings are complete. My mother doesn't know I'm alive. My brothers don't know I'm alive. They've been grieving for 6 months for nothing. Sarah's controlled facade cracked slightly, showing the first real emotion Marcus had seen from her. I just want them to know I'm okay. Thompson's expression softened. I'll see what I can do about expediting family notification. After Thompson left, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah for the first time since the extraction. She was staring out the small window in her room, watching helicopters take off and land on the nearby flight line. Can I ask you something? Sarah said without turning around. Sure. During the extraction, when you were treating me for potential injuries, you seemed familiar with my medical history. You checked my left shoulder specifically, and you looked at the scar on my hand like you'd seen it before. Marcus's blood ran cold. He had unconsciously checked the shoulder that Sarah had injured during ranger training, and he had noticed the scar from when she'd cut herself building a tree fort when they were kids. He thought he'd been subtle, but apparently his sister was more observant than he'd given her credit for. I was just being thorough, he said carefully. Sarah turned to look at him. Most medics check for obvious injuries first, then work their way to less apparent problems. You went straight to specific areas like you knew they might be weak points. Marcus realized he was walking into dangerous territory. I've seen a lot of combat injuries. You learn to recognize patterns. Sarah continued studying his face. And the way you moved when you were protecting me during the firefight. It wasn't just professional. It was personal. What do you mean? I mean, you moved like someone who couldn't bear the thought of me getting hurt. Like someone who would rather take a bullet himself than see me injured. She paused. I've seen that kind of protective instinct before, but only from family. Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. His sister had always been perceptive, even as a kid. She could tell when he was lying about homework or when he'd eaten the last piece of her birthday cake. But this was different. This was life-changing information that he wasn't sure either of them was ready for. You're reading too much into it, he said finally. I take my job seriously. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, still studying his face. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, less certain. What's your first name? I know your rank and last name from your uniform, but I'd like to know what to call you. Marcus hesitated. Once he told her his name, the game would be up. Sarah would put the pieces together immediately. Marcus, he said quietly. Sarah went very still. Marcus Rivera. He nodded, watching as understanding dawned in her eyes. Oh my God. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Oh my God, it's you. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the small hospital room. Marcus could see a dozen different emotions playing across his sister's face. Shock, disbelief, joy, anger, and something that might have been relief. How long have you known? She asked. Since you told us your name during the extraction. I recognized you right after that. And you didn't say anything? Marcus ran a hand through his hair. I didn't know how. I didn't know if you were ready for this. Sarah stood up from the bed and took a step toward him, then stopped. 6 months, Marcus. 6 months, I thought I might die without ever seeing my family again. 6 months, I wondered if you were still alive, if Mom was okay, if Danny had done something stupid and gotten himself killed trying to avenge me. Mom's okay, Marcus said quickly. She's been worried sick, but she's okay. And Danny's stateside, training with the Rangers. But you knew who I was, and you didn't say anything. There was hurt in her voice now, alongside the relief. Sarah, do you have any idea what it's like to be rescued by your own brother and not know it? To spend 3 hours thinking you're alone in the world when family was right there the whole time. Marcus felt the weight of his decision settling on him. I thought I was protecting you. You seemed so controlled, so focused on just surviving the immediate situation. I didn't want to add emotional stress to everything else you were dealing with. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was calmer, but still strained. You know what the worst part of captivity was? It wasn't the physical hardship or even the fear. It was the isolation. It was thinking that nobody was looking for me, that maybe my family had been told I was dead and had moved on. We never stopped looking, Marcus said firmly. Mom still set the place for you at dinner. Danny carries your picture in his gear. He stopped, not sure how much to reveal. You what? I volunteered for this deployment specifically because intel suggested you might be in this region. I've been on 14 extraction missions in the past 4 months, hoping one of them would be you. Sarah stared at him, and Marcus could see tears forming in her eyes for the first time since the rescue. 14 missions? 14. And I would have done 14 more. Sarah closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps and wrapped her arms around him. Marcus felt her shoulders shaking as months of suppressed emotion finally found release. I thought I was going to die without saying goodbye, she whispered against his shoulder. I thought I was going to die, and you'd never know how sorry I was about the fight we had at Dad's funeral. Marcus held his sister tightly, remembering that fight. It had been about her decision to volunteer for increasingly dangerous missions, about his belief that she was taking unnecessary risks. Harsh words had been exchanged, words they'd both regretted, but had never had the chance to take back. That doesn't matter now, he said. None of that matters now. They held each other in the quiet hospital room, 2 siblings who had found their way back to each other through the chaos of war. Outside, Marcus could hear the usual sounds of the base. Vehicles moving, helicopters landing, soldiers going about their duties. But inside Room 7, the world had narrowed down to just the 2 of them, finally reunited after months of fear and uncertainty. When they finally separated, Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at her brother with a mixture of affection and exasperation. You know Mom's going to kill you for not telling me immediately, right? Marcus laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. Yeah, I figured that was coming. And Danny's going to be impossible when he finds out his big brother was the one who brought me home. Let him. He deserves to be happy about something. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the extraction, Marcus saw a glimpse of his sister he remembered, strong, capable, but with a warmth that could light up any room. So what happens now? She asked. Now we get you home, Marcus said simply. Everything else we can figure out later. The secure briefing room in the intelligence section of Forward Operating Base Chapman was windowless and sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast sharp shadows on the metal table where Sarah sat across from Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base intelligence officer. Marcus stood near the back wall, officially there as Sarah's medical monitor, but really there because he refused to leave his sister alone during what was essentially an interrogation. It had been 2 days since the reunion in the hospital room, 2 days of medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and preliminary debriefings. Sarah had cooperated with everything, answering questions with military precision while maintaining the emotional distance that Marcus was beginning to recognize as her primary coping mechanism. Colonel Hayes was a career intelligence officer with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd spent the morning reviewing Sarah's service record and the circumstances of her capture, and now she was ready to dive into the details of Sarah's captivity. Major Connor, Colonel Hayes began, consulting her notes. I want to start with the original mission. Tell me what you remember about the operation that led to your capture. Sarah sat straight in her chair, her hands folded on the table in front of her. We were conducting a reconnaissance mission in the Korangal Valley, mapping supply routes used by Taliban forces moving weapons from Pakistan. It was supposed to be a 3-day observation mission. How many personnel were involved? 4. Myself, Staff Sergeant Mike Chun, Corporal Lisa Rodriguez, and Sergeant First Class David Park. Marcus had read the classified reports about the mission. Sarah's team had been declared missing after they failed to report in at their scheduled communication window. A search and rescue operation had found evidence of a firefight, but no bodies, no survivors, and no clear indication of what had happened to the team. What went wrong? Colonel Hayes asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see the careful way she was organizing her thoughts. We were compromised. Someone knew we were coming. How do you know that? Because they were waiting for us. Not just random security, not just bad luck running into a patrol. They knew our route, our timeline, our communication schedule. They had positioned forces specifically to intercept us. Colonel Hayes made notes as Sarah spoke. Did you see evidence of this during the actual engagement? The ambush came from three sides simultaneously, coordinated radio communications between the attacking forces, and they knew to jam our communications frequencies at exactly the right moment. That's not something you improvise. Marcus watched his sister's face as she recounted these details. Her voice remained steady and professional, but he could see the tightness around her eyes that suggested these memories were still difficult to discuss. What happened to the rest of your team? Colonel Hayes asked gently. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Chun and Park were killed in the initial ambush. Rodriguez and I were wounded but managed to evade capture for almost 18 hours. Sarah paused, collecting herself. She died from her injuries about 6 hours before they found me. I'm sorry, Colonel Hayes said, and Marcus could hear genuine sympathy in her voice. I know this is difficult, but I need to understand how they were able to capture you specifically. They brought dogs, tracked us to a cave where we'd taken shelter. Rodriguez was unconscious from blood loss, and I was trying to treat her injuries. I could have kept evading them, but I couldn't carry her, and she was dying anyway. I surrendered to try to get medical help for her. But they didn't provide medical assistance? Sarah's laugh was bitter. No, they let her die while they watched. Said it was a lesson about the consequences of American interference. Marcus felt anger building in his chest. He'd known intellectually that Sarah had been through something terrible, but hearing the specific details made it personal in a way that threatened his professional composure. Tell me about your captivity, Colonel Hayes continued. You mentioned being moved frequently. 7 different locations over 6 months. They moved me every 3 to 6 weeks, usually at night, always with different handlers. Sometimes it was caves in the mountains, sometimes compounds like the one where you found me. Once it was an abandoned school building. Did you see other prisoners during this time? A few, mostly local people who had been accused of cooperating with coalition forces. One other American, but only briefly. Colonel Hayes looked up sharply. Another American? Military, contractor, security specialist, named James Morrison. Mid-30s, from Texas originally. He'd been captured about a month before me, during an attack on a convoy near Kandahar. What happened to him? Sarah's expression grew darker. They executed him. Made me watch. Said it was another lesson about consequences. The room fell silent. Marcus could see Colonel Hayes processing this information, probably cross-referencing it with other intelligence reports about missing persons and contractor casualties. Major Connor, I need to ask you about the interrogations. What kind of information were they trying to extract from you? Everything. Troop strength, patrol schedules, base layouts, operational plans, communication procedures, names of local assets working with coalition forces. They were particularly interested in special operations activities. How did they conduct these interrogations? Sarah glanced at Marcus, then back at Colonel Hayes. Standard techniques: sleep deprivation, stress positions, temperature manipulation, psychological pressure. They threatened to kill other prisoners if I didn't cooperate. They showed me videos of previous executions. But you didn't provide the information they wanted? I gave them nothing of operational value. Some basic information that they could have gotten from open sources, a few deliberately misleading details about routine activities. Nothing that could compromise ongoing operations or put other soldiers at risk. Colonel Hayes made more notes. That kind of resistance requires significant mental strength. How were you able to maintain your resolve? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer. I thought about my family. My mother, my brothers. I thought about the soldiers who would die if I betrayed their trust. And I thought about my father. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Their father had been a Marine, killed in Iraq when Sarah was 19 and Marcus was 21. His death had motivated both of them to pursue military careers, and his memory had sustained them through some of their darkest moments. Tell me about the intelligence you mentioned collecting, Colonel Hayes said, moving to what Marcus suspected was the real purpose of this briefing. Sarah straightened in her chair. Over 6 months, I overheard a lot of conversations. My captors weren't always careful about what they said in front of me, especially when they thought I was unconscious or didn't understand their language. What kind of conversations? Discussions about future operations, details about their intelligence sources, names of people providing them with information about coalition activities. Colonel Hayes leaned forward. You mentioned sources. Are you saying they had assets inside coalition forces? I'm saying they knew things they shouldn't have known. Specific details about operations that hadn't happened yet. Changes to patrol routes that had only been decided hours earlier. Locations of forward operating bases that weren't on any public maps. Did you hear specific names? Sarah nodded slowly. Some. Not always clear, sometimes in languages I didn't fully understand, but enough to piece together patterns. I need those names, Major. Sarah looked at Colonel Hayes steadily. And I'll provide them. But first, I need assurances about what's going to happen with this information. What kind of assurances? I need to know that this investigation will be thorough and will go wherever the evidence leads, regardless of rank or position. I need to know that the people responsible for betraying American forces will be held accountable. And I need to know that my family will be protected if this information puts them at risk. Marcus understood his sister's caution. If there really were intelligence leaks at high levels, coming forward with that information could make her a target for retaliation. Colonel Hayes considered Sarah's demands. I can promise you a thorough investigation. I can't promise you specific outcomes, because that will depend on what the evidence shows. As for protection for your family, that can be arranged if the threat assessment justifies it. Sarah nodded slowly. That's fair. But there's one more thing. What's that? I want my brother involved in this investigation. Both Colonel Hayes and Marcus looked surprised. Major, Sergeant Rivera, is a medic, not an intelligence specialist, Colonel Hayes said. My brother is also someone I trust completely. If we're talking about potential leaks and betrayals within our own forces, I want someone involved who I know is absolutely reliable. Marcus felt a complex mix of pride and concern. Pride that his sister trusted him so completely, concern about what kind of danger this investigation might put them both in. I'm not sure that's appropriate, Colonel Hayes began. Then, I'm not sure I'm ready to share what I know, Sarah replied calmly. Colonel Hayes studied Sarah's face, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she turned to Marcus. Sergeant Rivera, are you willing to participate in a classified investigation that could take months to complete and might involve significant personal risk? Marcus didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am. If it helps bring home the people responsible for what happened to my sister and her team, then yes. Very well. But understand that once you're read into this investigation, there's no going back. The information you'll have access to is highly classified and extremely sensitive. I understand. Colonel Hayes turned back to Sarah. Major Connor, are you ready to proceed? Sarah nodded. The first name I heard mentioned multiple times was someone they called the accountant. Based on the context of their conversations, this person provided detailed financial information about coalition supply contracts and payment schedules. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah methodically recounted every piece of intelligence she had gathered during her captivity. Names, dates, operational details, patterns of communication between her captors, and their sources. She had an extraordinary memory for detail, recalling conversations word for word, describing the physical characteristics of people she had seen, providing sketches of compound layouts, and organizational charts of the groups that had held her. Marcus found himself in awe of his sister's mental discipline. She had turned her captivity into an intelligence-gathering operation, memorizing everything she could in the hope that it would someday be useful. It was exactly the kind of thing their father would have done. As the briefing concluded, Colonel Hayes gathered her notes and looked at both siblings. This information is going to require significant follow-up investigation. I'll need you both to remain on base until we can verify some of these details and determine the full scope of what we're dealing with. How long are we talking about? Marcus asked. Could be weeks. Could be months. It depends on what our investigation reveals. After Colonel Hayes left, Marcus and Sarah sat alone in the briefing room, both of them processing the weight of what had just been shared. "Are you sure you want me involved in this?" Marcus asked. "This could get dangerous." Sarah looked at him with the same steady gaze he remembered from their childhood, when she was trying to decide whether to trust him with one of her secrets. "Marcus, for 6 months, I survived by telling myself that my family was out there somewhere, staying strong, fighting to bring me home. Now I find out that my brother literally was fighting to bring me home." She paused. "If there are people in our own forces who betrayed my team, who got Chun and Park and Rodriguez killed, then I want them found. And I want someone I trust absolutely watching my back while we do it." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we do this together." "Together," Sarah agreed. Outside the briefing room, the normal activities of the forward operating base continued. Soldiers went about their duties, helicopters brought in supplies, and took out wounded. The war ground on with its relentless pace. But inside that sterile room, 2 siblings had committed themselves to a different kind of mission. One that would test not just their professional skills, but the bonds of family that had already survived separation, loss, and the crucible of combat. Marcus realized that rescuing Sarah from physical captivity had been only the beginning. Now, they had to rescue the truth from whatever conspiracy had put her there in the first place. And unlike the extraction mission that had brought them back together, this new mission had no clear timeline, no defined enemy, and no guarantee of success. But they would face it together, just as their father had taught them to face everything, with courage, integrity, and an absolute commitment to protecting the people who depended on them. 3 weeks into the investigation, Marcus found himself in places he'd never expected to go as a Navy SEAL medic. Instead of treating combat injuries in forward operating bases, he was sitting in secure conference rooms, analyzing financial records and communication intercepts alongside intelligence professionals who spoke in acronyms and dealt in secrets that could reshape military operations across the entire theater. The investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. What started as Sarah's debriefing about her captivity had evolved into a comprehensive examination of intelligence leaks that potentially stretched back months, maybe years. Colonel Hayes had assembled a small team of investigators, and at Sarah's insistence, Marcus had been granted temporary assignment to the unit with a security clearance that gave him access to information he sometimes wished he'd never seen. The secure facility where they worked was located in a converted shipping container on the outskirts of Bagram Airfield, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. Inside, banks of computers and communication equipment lined the walls, while a large table in the center was covered with documents, photographs, and organizational charts that mapped out the complex network they were trying to unravel. Sarah stood at a whiteboard, pointing to a timeline she had constructed showing the correlation between various intelligence leaks and attacks on coalition forces. She had thrown herself into the investigation with the same intensity Marcus remembered from her childhood, when she would spend hours working on puzzles or projects that captured her attention. "The pattern is clear when you look at it chronologically," Sarah was explaining to the team assembled around the table. "Every major attack on coalition convoys in this region over the past 8 months was preceded by a request for specific operational information from someone inside our own intelligence network." Captain James Wheeler, the Army intelligence officer who served as Colonel Hayes' deputy, studied the timeline with a skeptical expression. "That could be coincidence. Our enemies are always probing for intelligence opportunities." "Not this kind of coincidence," Sarah replied, tapping the board with her marker. "These weren't fishing expeditions or broad intelligence gathering. These were specific requests for exact information that would be needed to conduct precise attacks." Marcus looked at the evidence Sarah had assembled and felt a sick certainty in his stomach. His sister wasn't just thorough, she was brilliant at pattern recognition, a skill that had made her one of the Army's most effective special operations officers. If she saw a connection, it was almost certainly there. "Walk us through the Morrison convoy attack," Colonel Hayes requested. Sarah moved to a different section of the timeline. March 15th. A convoy carrying James Morrison and 3 other contractors was attacked approximately 12 kilometers east of Kandahar. The attack occurred at exactly the point where the convoy's route crossed an exposed valley with no cover and limited escape routes. Standard ambush location, Captain Wheeler observed. Except the convoy's route had been changed 6 hours earlier due to intelligence about a potential IED on their original path. Only 4 people knew about the route change in advance: the convoy commander, his operations officer, the intelligence analyst who provided the updated threat assessment, and whoever that analyst reported to. Colonel Hayes leaned forward, and the attack happened at the exact spot where the new route was most vulnerable. The attackers were already in position, which means they knew about the route change before the convoy even departed. The room was quiet as the implications of Sarah's analysis sank in. Marcus had heard the story of Morrison's capture and eventual execution during Sarah's debriefing, but seeing it laid out as part of a larger pattern made it clear that Morrison's death wasn't just a casualty of war. It was the result of deliberate betrayal. Who was the intelligence analyst who provided the route update? Marcus asked. Colonel Hayes consulted her notes. Captain David Park. He's been transferred back to the States since then. Sarah went very still. Did you say Captain David Park? Yes. Why? Because Sergeant First Class David Park was one of the soldiers killed during the ambush that led to my capture. Same name, probably not a coincidence. The room erupted in discussion as the investigators began pulling up personnel records and cross-referencing assignments. Marcus watched his sister's face and could see her mind working through the implications of this new connection. Colonel, Sarah said quietly, cutting through the chatter, I need to see Captain Park's complete service record and his current assignment location. 20 minutes later, they had assembled a comprehensive file on Captain David Park, and the picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Park had been involved in intelligence analysis for multiple operations that had subsequently suffered security breaches. His requests for classified information had consistently exceeded what his assignments required. And, most damning, financial records showed unexplained deposits into accounts associated with his family members. We need to bring him in for questioning, Captain Wheeler said. He's not going anywhere, Colonel Hayes replied, looking at her computer screen. According to this, Captain Park died in a car accident outside Fort Bragg 2 weeks ago. The room fell silent again. Marcus felt the familiar chill that came with realizing they were dealing with something much larger and more dangerous than they'd originally thought. That's a hell of a coincidence, Sarah said grimly. There are no coincidences in intelligence work, Colonel Hayes replied. Only patterns we haven't recognized yet. Over the following days, the investigation took on a new urgency. If Captain Park had been silenced to prevent him from revealing information about the intelligence leak, it meant that whoever was running the operation was willing to kill American soldiers to protect their secret. It also meant that Sarah, Marcus, and everyone else involved in the investigation were potentially in danger. Marcus found himself thinking about their father during the long hours of reviewing documents and analyzing data. Their father had been killed by an IED while conducting a routine patrol in Iraq, a death that the family had always accepted as a tragic but random casualty of war. But now Marcus wondered if there had been more to it, if their father too had been betrayed by someone who was supposed to be on his side. Sarah seemed to be having similar thoughts. Late one evening, as they worked alone in the secure facility, she broke the silence that had settled between them. Do you ever wonder about Dad's death? She asked without looking up from the file she was reviewing. Marcus felt his chest tighten. What do you mean? I mean, do you ever wonder if it was really just bad luck? Or if someone set him up? The question hung between them like a physical presence. Marcus had been wondering the same thing, but hearing Sarah voice it made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. I've thought about it, he admitted, but his death was investigated. They found no evidence of intelligence leaks or deliberate targeting. They found no evidence because they weren't looking for the right patterns. They were looking at his death as an isolated incident, not as part of a larger operation. Sarah pulled out a folder that Marcus hadn't seen before. I requested Dad's complete service record and the investigation files from his death. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. Sarah, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that 3 members of our family have now been involved in operations that were compromised by intelligence leaks. Dad's patrol, my reconnaissance mission, and your extraction operation that walked into an ambush. That's not coincidence. She opened a folder and spread out documents that showed their father's patrol routes, mission assignments, and the circumstances of his death. Marcus found himself looking at official reports and photographs that he'd never wanted to see, evidence of the moment when their family's life had been forever changed. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a specific entry in their father's mission logs. 3 days before he was killed, he filed a report about irregularities in intelligence briefings for his unit. He thought someone was providing their patrol schedules to unauthorized personnel. Marcus stared at the document, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. He was investigating a potential intelligence leak, and he died before he could complete his investigation. The implications were staggering. If their father had been killed to silence him, then the conspiracy they were uncovering had been operating for years, claiming American lives and compromising military operations on a massive scale. "We need to tell Colonel Hayes about this," Marcus said. "We need to be very careful about who we tell," Sarah replied. "If this conspiracy has been operating for years, if it's been able to kill American soldiers to protect itself, then it has resources and reach that we don't fully understand." Marcus looked around the secure facility where they'd been working, suddenly wondering if their conversations were truly private, if their investigation was truly secure. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that until we know the full extent of this operation, we trust no one except each other. We follow the evidence wherever it leads, but we keep our most sensitive discoveries between us until we're ready to act." Over the next week, Sarah and Marcus conducted their own parallel investigation, digging into their father's death and looking for connections to the current conspiracy. What they found was a pattern of suspicious deaths and compromised operations stretching back more than 5 years, all potentially connected to the same intelligence leak that had led to Sarah's capture. They worked in careful secrecy, using their access to the official investigation to gather information while pursuing their own lines of inquiry during off hours. Marcus found himself learning skills he never expected to need: document analysis, financial investigation, operational security. Sarah coached him through the process, teaching him how to recognize patterns and connections that weren't immediately obvious. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered a financial connection between Captain Park and a contractor named David Morrison. Not James Morrison, who had been executed, but a different Morrison who worked for a private intelligence firm that had contracts with multiple military units throughout Afghanistan. "This Morrison has access to operational intelligence from across the theater," Sarah explained as they reviewed his personnel file. "He's been involved in briefings for special operations, convoy security, forward operating base construction, supply logistics, everything." "Access doesn't mean guilt," Marcus pointed out. "No, but look at this." Sarah showed him a series of financial records, large cash deposits into accounts associated with Morrison's extended family, always within days of major intelligence breaches. And the amounts increase over time, suggesting he was being paid more as he provided more valuable information. Marcus studied the evidence, feeling the same sick certainty he'd felt when Sarah first outlined the pattern of attacks and leaks. "We need to find out where Morrison is now." "Already did," Sarah replied grimly. "He's here, on this base. He was transferred to Bugram 3 days ago to provide intelligence support for a major operation scheduled for next week." The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The person responsible for betraying American forces, for getting Sarah's team killed, for potentially killing their father, was less than a mile away from where they sat. "What do we do?" he asked. Sarah looked at him with the same determined expression he'd seen on her face when they were kids, and she decided to tackle a problem that everyone else thought was impossible. "We finish what Dad started," she said simply. "We get the proof. We need to bring down this entire operation. And we make sure that everyone responsible for betraying American soldiers pays for what they've done." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of family obligation and military duty combining into a resolve that nothing could shake. They had come too far and learned too much to stop now. Outside their secure container, the war continued with its relentless pace. But inside, two siblings prepared for a different kind of battle. One that would determine not just the fate of a conspiracy that had claimed American lives, but the legacy of a father whose own investigation had been cut short by the very people he'd been trying to expose. The hunt was about to begin. The plan Sarah had devised was both elegant and dangerous. They would use Morrison's own system against him, feeding him false intelligence designed to expose his network while gathering the evidence needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. But it required Marcus to do something that went against every instinct he'd developed as a medic and soldier. He had to put his sister directly in harm's way. "I don't like this," Marcus said for the third time as they reviewed the details in their secure container. It was 2 a.m, and the base around them was quiet except for the distant sound of generators and the occasional helicopter taking off from the flight line. "You don't have to like it," Sarah replied, making notes on a tactical map. "You just have to trust me." "Sarah, we're talking about using you as bait to draw out people who have already killed American soldiers to protect their operation. People who tried to kill you once already." Sarah looked up from her planning materials. "Marcus, these people didn't try to kill me. They kept me alive for 6 months because I was more valuable as a source of intelligence than as a corpse. They're not going to kill me now unless they have no other choice. And what if we give them no other choice? Then we make sure we have enough evidence to bring down their entire network before that happens." Marcus studied his sister's face in the harsh fluorescent light of their workspace. In the weeks since her rescue, she had regained much of the weight she'd lost during captivity, and the constant work on the investigation had given her a sense of purpose that seemed to be healing some of the psychological wounds from her imprisonment. But Marcus could still see the shadows in her eyes, the careful way she positioned herself near exits, the hypervigilance that never completely relaxed. "There has to be another way," he said. "If there is, I haven't found it. Morrison is too careful, too well protected by legitimate intelligence protocols. The only way to get proof of what he's doing is to catch him in the act." The plan they had developed over the past week was based on Sarah's intimate knowledge of how intelligence flowed through military channels and Marcus's growing understanding of the financial and communication patterns they'd been tracking. They would create a fictional special operation, complete with false operational plans and fake intelligence requirements. Then use their positions within the investigation to ensure that Morrison had access to the information. If Morrison was indeed the source of the intelligence leaks, he would pass the false information to his contacts, allowing Sarah and Marcus to track the communication and identify the broader network. If they could record Morrison making contact with enemy forces or document him receiving payment for intelligence, they would have the evidence needed to bring charges not just against Morrison, but against everyone involved in the conspiracy. "The risk isn't just to you," Marcus pointed out. "If Morrison realizes what we're doing, he could expose our investigation to his handlers. We could lose everything we've worked for. Or we could finally get justice for Chun, Park, Rodriguez, and Dad," Sarah replied quietly. The mention of their father ended Marcus's resistance. He knew Sarah was right. They had reached the point where careful investigation could only take them so far. To get the proof they needed, someone had to take risks. "Okay," he said finally, "but we do this my way on the medical support. If something goes wrong, if you're injured or captured, I want resources in place to get you out immediately." Agreed. They spent the next 3 days setting up their operation. Sarah used her access to the official investigation to create false intelligence requirements that would naturally flow to Morrison through normal channels. The fictional operation involved a high-value target supposedly located in a remote valley north of Kandahar, complete with detailed operational plans, personnel assignments, and equipment lists. Marcus, meanwhile, worked with a small team of communication specialists to set up surveillance equipment that could track Morrison's electronic communications and record any meetings he might have with outside contacts. It was delicate work. The surveillance had to be comprehensive enough to capture evidence, but subtle enough that Morrison wouldn't detect it. The trap was set on a Thursday morning when Sarah submitted a formal intelligence request as part of the fictional operations planning process. According to their research, Morrison typically made contact with his handlers within 24 hours of receiving significant intelligence, usually through coded messages sent via commercial email accounts or brief meetings in public areas of the base. Marcus positioned himself in the base communications center where he could monitor Morrison's electronic activity, while Sarah maintained her normal routine within the investigation unit, ready to respond if their target took the bait. The waiting was agony. Marcus found himself checking and rechecking the surveillance equipment, analyzing every electronic communication that passed through the base's networks, looking for any sign that Morrison was acting on the false intelligence they had provided. The break came 18 hours after they'd initiated the operation. Morrison sent a brief email to an account registered in Dubai, using language that appeared to be discussing a family reunion, but which Marcus recognized as coded intelligence based on patterns they'd identified in previous communications. Got him. Marcus called to Sarah over their encrypted radio link. Are you sure? Marcus read the email aloud, highlighting the coded references to dates, locations, and personnel numbers that corresponded exactly to their false operational plan. It's definitely our intelligence. He took the bait. Now we wait to see who responds. The response came faster than either of them had expected. Within 6 hours, Morrison received a reply that included specific questions about tactical details that hadn't been included in the original intelligence summary. Someone on the receiving end was conducting a professional intelligence evaluation, asking follow-up questions that would allow them to plan a counter-operation. More importantly, the reply included instructions for a face-to-face meeting to discuss family matters at a specific location on the base, the motor pool maintenance facility, at a specific time the following evening. This is it, Sarah said, as they reviewed the intercepted communications in their secure container. We're going to get everything, Morrison, his contact, and proof of the entire operation. Marcus felt his stomach clench with anxiety. Or we're going to walk into a trap ourselves. Maybe, but it's a risk we have to take. The motor pool maintenance facility was located in a relatively isolated section of Bagram Airfield, surrounded by vehicle storage areas and equipment depots that would provide good cover for surveillance, but also multiple escape routes for anyone who realized they were being watched. Marcus and Sarah spent hours studying the area, planning their surveillance positions and escape routes, coordinating with the communications team to ensure they could record whatever meeting took place. As the time for Morrison's meeting approached, Marcus found himself thinking about their father again. Somewhere in Iraq years earlier, their father had been pursuing a similar investigation, following a similar pattern of intelligence leaks and betrayal. But their father had been working alone, without backup, without the resources that Marcus and Sarah had managed to assemble. It had cost him his life. Marcus was determined not to let history repeat itself. At 2300 hours, Morrison arrived at the motor pool facility exactly as scheduled. Marcus watched him through night vision equipment from a concealed position behind a damaged Humvee, while Sarah monitored from an elevated position that gave her a view of the entire area. Morrison waited near a specific maintenance bay for exactly 7 minutes before his contact arrived. The man who approached was wearing civilian clothes and carried himself like someone with military training, but Marcus didn't recognize him from base personnel files. The meeting was brief and professional. The unknown contact asked questions about the fictional operations timeline and personnel, while Morrison provided detailed answers based on the false intelligence he had received. Most crucially, the contact handed Morrison an envelope that Marcus assumed contained payment for the intelligence. "We've got them," Sarah's voice crackled through Marcus's earpiece. But as Morrison and his contact prepared to leave, something went wrong. The unknown man suddenly looked directly at Sarah's surveillance position and spoke rapidly into a radio. Morrison immediately began moving toward the exit, no longer walking casually, but moving with the urgent purpose of someone who had just realized he was being watched. "They've made us," Marcus said into his radio. "Sarah, get out of there now." But Sarah was already moving, abandoning her surveillance position and heading for their predetermined extraction point. Marcus began moving as well, staying low and using the parked vehicles for cover as he tried to reach the rendezvous location. The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of Sarah's last known position. Marcus felt his world narrow down to a single focus, getting to his sister. Training and instinct took over as he moved through the motor pool area, using everything he'd learned in 8 years of combat operations to navigate toward the source of the shooting while avoiding becoming a target himself. He found Sarah pinned down behind a concrete barrier, returning fire from 3 different positions. The unknown contact had apparently brought backup that had been positioned around the facility, turning what should have been a simple surveillance operation into a full firefight. "How many?" Marcus called out as he took position beside her. "At least 4, maybe more. They've got us bracketed from the north and east." Marcus assessed their tactical situation and realized it was deteriorating rapidly. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in an area with limited cover and few escape routes. Worse, the gunfire would soon attract base security, which could expose their unauthorized investigation and potentially compromise everything they had worked for. "We need to move," he told Sarah. "Where?" "They've got the exits covered." Marcus thought about the layout of the motor pool area, visualizing the routes they had studied during their planning. There was one option they hadn't considered because it was dangerous and had a low probability of success, but it might be their only chance. "The fuel depot," he said. "If we can get there, we can use the storage tanks for cover and work our way back to the main base." Sarah understood immediately. "That's 100 meters of open ground." "I know, but it's better than staying here." They began moving, using fire and maneuver tactics to advance toward the fuel depot while their attackers tried to maintain their encirclement. Marcus found himself falling back on every lesson he'd learned in combat, every skill he developed as both a medic and a SEAL as he tried to keep his sister alive and complete their mission. The fighting was intense, but brief. By the time they reached the relative safety of the fuel depot, base security had responded to the gunfire and was converging on the motor pool area. Morrison and his contacts had vanished into the maze of vehicles and equipment, but they had left behind something more valuable than their physical presence. They had confirmed everything that Sarah and Marcus had suspected about the intelligence leak. More importantly, the communications equipment they had deployed had recorded the entire meeting, including Morrison's detailed discussion of classified operational information and his acceptance of payment for providing intelligence to unauthorized personnel. "Did we get enough?" Sarah asked as they caught their breath behind a fuel storage tank. Marcus checked the communication device that had been recording their surveillance operation. "We got everything." Morrison confessing to providing classified information, receiving payment, the face and voice of his contact, everything we need. As base security secured the motor pool area and began investigating the firefight, Marcus and Sarah quietly made their way back to their secure container to review the evidence they had gathered. What they found was comprehensive proof of an intelligence operation that had been running for years, compromising American military operations and resulting in the deaths of countless soldiers. But they also found something else. Evidence that Morrison's contact was not just a random enemy operative, but a former American intelligence officer who had been declared killed in action 3 years earlier. The conspiracy was even deeper and more extensive than they had realized. "This goes all the way to the top," Sarah said as they analyzed the recordings and cross-referenced them with classified personnel files. "What do we do with this information?" Marcus asked. Sarah looked at the evidence they had assembled: recordings, financial documents, personnel files, operational reports, the complete picture of a betrayal that had cost American lives for years. "We take it to someone we trust completely," she said. "Someone with the authority and the integrity to make sure justice is served." "Who?" Sarah thought for a moment, then smiled grimly. "Colonel Hayes. She's been straight with us from the beginning, and she has the security clearance and command authority to take action on what we've found." The confrontation with Colonel Hayes took place the following morning in the same secure briefing room where their investigation had begun weeks earlier. Marcus and Sarah presented their evidence systematically, building the case piece by piece until the full scope of the conspiracy was clear. Colonel Hayes listened in silence, occasionally asking for clarification or additional detail, but mostly just absorbing the magnitude of what they had uncovered. When they finished their presentation, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing the implications. This is going to destroy careers and potentially compromise ongoing operations across the theater, she said finally. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. But it's also going to save American lives and restore integrity to our intelligence operations. Colonel nodded slowly. You both understand that this investigation is now going to expand far beyond what we originally anticipated. We're talking about a full-scale investigation that will involve multiple agencies and could take years to complete. We understand, Marcus said, and you both understand that your lives may be in danger once we begin making arrests. The people involved in this conspiracy have already shown they're willing to kill American soldiers to protect their operation. We understand that too, Sarah said. Colonel Hayes looked at both of them with something that might have been pride. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here. You've honored his memory and his service. 3 months later, Marcus stood on the tarmac at Dover Air Force Base, watching as his sister walked across the asphalt toward their mother and younger brother. The investigation had resulted in 17 arrests, including Morrison and 6 other current and former military personnel who had been involved in the intelligence leak. The conspiracy had been dismantled, and steps had been taken to prevent similar breaches in the future. Sarah had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions during captivity and her role in exposing the intelligence leak. Marcus had received a Bronze Star for his part in the investigation and his actions during the firefight at the motor pool. But the real reward was simpler and more personal. Sarah was home, alive, and safe. Their family was together again. And the people responsible for betraying American soldiers, including the people who had killed their father, were facing justice. As Marcus watched his sister embrace their mother for the first time in almost a year, he thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a routine extraction mission in Afghanistan and had evolved into something much larger and more complex than anyone had anticipated. But in the end, it had been about family, about a brother and sister who had refused to give up on each other, who had honored the memory of their father by finishing the work he had started, and who had proved that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that bring you home. The helicopter blades that had carried them into danger months earlier had been replaced by the gentle sound of a summer breeze in Delaware. The chaos of combat had been replaced by the quiet joy of a family reunion. And the silence that had surrounded Sarah's captivity had been broken by the voices of people who loved her, welcoming her home. Marcus smiled as he watched his sister laugh at something their younger brother had said, and he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them the way they had faced everything else, together as family with the courage and integrity their father had taught them to value above all else. The story was over, but the love that had sustained them through it would continue forever.